Good morning, good afternoon, or hello to everybody. I'm happy and honored to be here with you today. My name is Silvia Mazzini, and I am the director of the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, where I also teach philosophy and aesthetics. And today we have a great lecture entitled Composition, Politics, and the Problem of Decision-Making in Latour and Serre. And this is a lecture of David Webb, Professor David Webb, that is here with us, and I welcome him very warmly. So David Webb is Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University, and his book, Foucault's Archaeology, Science and Transformation, Edinburgh University Press, 2013, set Foucault's archaeology against the background of French philosophy and science. So we see also here this meeting of different backgrounds and cultures. It's one of the aspects that also works with HVA very well. And his interests include Foucault's conception of critique as a rational practice, and the work of Michel Serre, as we will see today, especially with regard to ethics, politics, and ecological philosophy. He has published several papers and book chapters on the work of Serre, and is co-editor of the series Michel Serre and Material Futures at the Bloomsbury Press, and the co-translator of Serre, Birth of Physics, together with Bill Ross, so published in 2018. And well, this lecture is really in line with some research directors of HVA, so the dialogue, for example, between at least two thinkers. I say at least, let's see, well, three with you, David, and many others with all of us. Hermeneutics and the exchange of perspectives, the topic of Anthropocene. We also had a series of lectures on this, and the role of artist philosophers and philosophers reflecting and doing and making something with the earth on a cosmic level. And so we will be happy here to listen then to the lecture. After the lecture, we will have the opportunity to ask questions and broadening the dialogue. So with HVA's community and beyond, also all our guests that are welcome. As we had also in our webinar last week, I also kindly ask here not to use the chat. But we are in a polyphonics exchange only on this webinar, and question and answers, you can ask them after the lecture, and there is a button exactly for the Q&A. So thank you already for thinking and doing with us. And as I said, David Webb is working on many topics, is a friend, if I may use this word, David, of HVA, and more than a friend. So actually, as a visiting faculty, again, also next semester, will co-teach a course with the ethico-aesthetic course with our president, Professor Simonetta Moro. And since she's also here, I would welcome her. Thank you for being with us. And I suppose she would like to welcome you, David.
Yes, I'll be very brief. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, David, for being here. As Sylvia reminded you, David has also been teaching courses with IDSVA. The first time was as a visiting faculty at Spannocchia, a couple of years ago, where in fact he gave a few lectures on Michel Serre, particularly around this question of the birth of physics in relation to Lucretius. So there was a wonderful way to begin this conversation that is ongoing. I also know David as a translator of some of Gianni Vattimo's works, and in fact, in English. And in fact, David contributed to the Vattimo dictionary that I edited a couple of years ago. So thank you so much, David, for being here, and looking forward to your talk. And now I disappear.
Thank you, Simonetta. Thank you, Sylvia. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to you all. Now, I hope I'm going to talk through a few ideas over the next kind of 40 minutes or so. I have some slides which are just there to sort of give you a little bit of something to look at other than me sometimes. So I hope you can see those and you can follow along clearly. All right. I hope that if that's not the case, I'm sure somebody will let me know. So what does this talk about? Well, the title, Competition Politics and the Problem of Decision Making, may not in itself really make that terribly clear. The question is this. The question is how we as humans live together, not only with each other, but with other beings of all kinds. And I think this is a question which is especially urgent today, perhaps more so than ever. Political, cultural divisions are, of course, felt very acutely, but in addition, we face the prospect of climate breakdown, the risk of species extinction, all manner of challenges over how we live with what we might call nature or the non-human, although both terms I think are rather inadequate to the very tangled existence that we increasingly recognize, where we don't really have a clear, simple distinction between the human on one side and nature on the other side. We are very much caught up and entangled one with the other. Now, questions of this kind have been addressed by ecological thinkers of various kinds, but in this talk I'm looking specifically at Bruno Latour and Michel. Right? And moreover, I'm not going to deal with their work on nature and ecology, although that might seem like the obvious thing to do, not directly, but this will remain very much in the background or the kind of context of what I'm talking about. Instead, what I'm really going to focus on is the question of how Latour and Serre think. That's the starting point, really. How do they think? Well, we shall get to that. The question we begin with is, how do we make a world? How do we make a world? And this leads to further questions. What is a world? What form of agreement or unity does it exhibit? And further, what kind of process leads to such a world? How do we get there? What can we do to work towards it? So questions about how Latour and think, as you can see, quickly become questions about the kind of world we think about and indeed live in. Now, in their work, Latour and Serre both confront this problem of how collectives are composed and how politics is to be understood when it extends beyond the purely human. Now, their shared concern, I think, is with the broader question of how humans, non-humans, artifacts and processes come together to form a world. And in this sense, at stake are the conditions for making what are ultimately political decisions about the composition of this world. For Latour, decision-making, as we'll see, is irreducibly political because it has no transcendental grounds. There is no principle or form of reason that can settle in advance what truly or properly belongs to the collective, what truly or properly belongs in the world. For Latour, every inclusion and exclusion is provisional. And, oh, hang on a minute. I forgot to start sharing because I was sharing the screen. Thank you, Jen, for the reminder. There we go. Let me start Where are we? Okay, there we go. Now you should be able to see things. Sorry, I was sharing it before, stopped sharing it, and then completely forgot to start sharing it again. So hopefully you should be able to see that now. Again, somebody will tell me if that's not the case. Good. Okay, right. So for Latour, all decisions, all inclusions and exclusions about what goes into this world that we're trying to make are provisional and must be negotiated. Right. By contrast, Serre gives weight to what I think we can call the connective threads that already shape things and their interrelations. His account, Serre's account, stresses the a navigation across multiple scales of space and time, guided by what he calls prescriptive codes of physical and historical processes. Now, that term prescriptive we'll come back to. Right? So I think we can say in this sense that Serre appeals to a form of reason. Why can I say that I think he appeals to a form of reason? Because in looking at these prescriptions, these codes written into the physical and historical processes of the world, he's really looking for the way that the world itself makes sense. And I guess one could say, what is reason if not a way of making sense of things? So what I think Serre is looking for is a reason that arises from the world. It's the reason of things, from things, rather than some abstract or ideal form that we impose upon them. Okay, so we have on the one hand a political process, negotiation without any preconditions, and on the other, an idea that we find in the world some prescriptions that we can follow. So in this talk, I'll look at these two forms of composition, or these two ways in which we can understand how composition might work. I'll begin by tracing Latour's, what Latour calls the principle, his principle of irreducibility. And from there, look briefly at his account of translation as a forging of equivalences, before then turning to Michel Serre's notion of translation as the tracing of an invariance. We'll come back to all these ideas further on. Their different positions share, as I've said, a rejection of reason as transcendental or universal. And they also share an emphasis on the composition of a world by the movement from one locality to another. So a world is made, if you like, step by step, stitch by stitch, not by trying to define it in one go as a whole, identifying its essence or its universal characteristics or its definitive boundaries or anything of the kind, right? So they have certain things in common in this way. Yet their divergence becomes clear when we consider how they conceive of the networks that they see in the world, right? How they conceive of networks and the spaces between networks. This is where we'll see a divergence between the two positions. For Latour, these spaces are precisely the site of politics and negotiation. For Serre, they're not gaps at all, really, but flows of order and disorder, some of which we can navigate directly, and some of which occur at scales of space and time which are far remote from our kind of immediate lives and our immediate concerns. This difference between Latour and Serre reframes the problem of decision making. How do we begin to compose a world? What do we include or exclude? This difference reframes that problem as part of a wider inquiry into composition and politics, precisely. And I think it bears especially on ecological thought at the time of emergency, we might say, in which we find ourselves now, when the challenge is not only to compose a common world, but to do so in concert, in harmony to some extent, as best we can, with a changing Earth. Now, let's turn to Bruno Latour specifically. In his book, The Politics of Nature, How to Bring the Sciences into Democracy, Latour describes an institutional process. I mean, this is a bit of a thought experiment on his part. He's thinking, what might a kind of political negotiation for making the world look like? And it's a thought experiment of kinds. I don't think he's proposing quite that it's carried out in literal terms, although he has sort of elaborated some sort of thoughts and experiments in that direction. Anyway, in this book, The Politics of Nature, Latour describes an institutional process for deciding who and what to include in the world, the collective. All things, human and non-human alike, present propositions that matter to them. So they and petition, if you like, for these propositions that matter to them, to saying what they care about, what matters to them, claiming or making the petition that these be included. The work of deciding which are admitted is undertaken by two houses. The responsibility of the upper house, as in the kind of houses of government, the responsibility of the upper house is to establish whose claims will be heard and in what form, and then it's the task of the lower house to decide on the basis of these claims who or what will in fact be included in the collective world. Now, as Latour sort of goes on to specify, in fact, the candidates for inclusion are not so much individual things, but more propositions, habits in which things of different kinds are combined. And the aim in trying to find ways of putting all these things together is to constitute a world by admitting, including those which are most compatible and excluding those which are most incompatible. Now, as Latour openly acknowledges, this process is, as I said, it's a kind of thought experiment. But actually, it's not just a thought experiment in kind of imagined practice of democracy. He's borrowing this idea in a way from the 17th century philosopher Leibniz. The process that Latour has described here is a sort of terrestrial and political version of Leibniz's account of the way that God composes a world from all the possibilities that press their claims to exist. All the things that could have existed, that might be possible, that might have been possible. And Leibniz's God surveys the entire eternity of the world, all these possibilities, and includes those which are most compossible, most fitting together, and excludes those which are least so, right? And so the process that Latour describes is a sort of, as I say, a terrestrial and political kind of version of this idea of the composition of the world by God. Importantly, however, that's just a bit of an aside, it's an interesting context, but importantly, for Latour, all decisions in this process are provisional, and any claims that are refused at any time can be heard again at a later time or in a new form. Now, what's the point of this? The point is fundamentally that Latour insists that everything remains open and negotiable. In this sense, decisions about who and what to include in the world and how are fundamentally political. That is to say, the decision-making process cannot appeal to any principle in order to make that decision, unless that principle itself has been negotiated and agreed. And that's his view of a sort of what a rigorously, sort of unflinchingly political process for making the world would look like. Excuse me. Now, the absence of principles or rational criteria for deciding on the constitution of the world is linked then to what Latour calls the principle of irreducibility. There's a work of his, a very fascinating work called Irreductions, which is included in English in the book The Pasteurization of France. And in the opening line of Irreductions, Latour writes that nothing is by itself either reducible or irreducible to anything else. That's one of those great lines which gives you pause and makes you stop and think, okay, well, if it's not reducible or irreducible, what is it exactly? But the challenge here is to, I think, to see both reducibility and irreducibility as kinds of relations, and things begin without even that, right? That's the kind of default position. We can't even say that something is reducible or irreducible. To arrive at that point, work has to be done, something has to happen. Right? So in this state in which nothing is either reducible or irreducible to anything else, we have a kind of indeterminacy. And I mean, it may not play, it doesn't really play an important part right here, but I think this state of indeterminacy is reminiscent of Lucretian atomism and what Sayre calls the cloud or noise. It's that state of kind of chaos and turbulence before order emerges. Right? I only think it's worth popping in here as an observation that there's a sort of similarity perhaps here, because I'm thinking about the relationship between Latour and Sayre himself draws strongly on Lucretius. Now, Latour writes that we can speak here in this state where nothing is by itself reducible or irreducible to anything else. We can speak here of, he writes, says, forces, weaknesses, monads, actants or actors that associate with one another and in doing so constitute what is real in the form of a network. So this can happen. We don't start with that. Something has to happen to arrive at that point. And he says, when two forces or actors enter into such a relation, the terms of that relation must first be negotiated, which Latour notes often involves the strongest force imposing those terms on the weaker. Though, he adds, no force is so weak that it cannot become stronger by forming an alliance, perhaps with other weaker forces. Now, in line with the principle of irreducibility, the terms that any actor, actant imposes on another are not determined in advance by any rules, laws, or structures, though it is possible, probably likely, that an actant or actor may adopt and promote or promulgate rules that it has learned from other actors or actants. In other words, patterns do reproduce themselves, okay? But there are no fixed laws or structures defined in the beginning. We have then, in effect, rules that arise as regularities in the course of what is, in effect, a game. But it's a game whose rules may change at each turn or with each throw of the dice, which is to say, those rules do not transcend or precede the order to which they apply, even though they're often presented as doing so. And that's Latour's point. It's not his, it's a point he makes in this way. I mean, other philosophers will make it in other ways, but that is, we can look at what is presented to us as inevitable, universal, natural, necessary, and discover that when we look more closely, that it's not so, right? Reflecting on this, Latour writes, he has quite a lovely turn of phrase. He's quite a funny writer sometimes. He says, in love, as in war, all is fair in the attempt to attach the rules to something more durable than the moment that inspired them. Right. Now, Latour describes this process of forming alliances or associations as one of translation, where he writes that the aim of translation is to render two propositions equivalent. Now, this idea extends beyond a movement between languages, natural languages, translating between French and English or whatever, because reason itself employs translation in a sense. For example, in constructing chains of inference, where one thing is shown to have a kind of equivalence with another, that one thing leads to another, that you can take a sense from here and you can translate it into a further sense. But Latour states that in doing so, reason aims to establish an equivalence between sentences in such a way that a sentence is displaced while pretending not to have moved. It's translated while pretending to have stayed faithful, he says. So he has this idea about what's going on here. Well, we can think we can, when we look at reason, making sense of things, putting things together, explaining the connections between things, showing that one thing is really the same as something else, is a way, excuse me, a way of forcing equivalence where it doesn't really exist. And then pretending that these things were equivalent all along, that nothing has happened here, that there was no forcing involved, right? Hence this, excuse me, hence this question that he asks: what would knowledge and power look like if no distinction were made between force and reason? That's a really powerful question, I think. Reason, then, as I say, makes makes something equivalent which is not, while concealing this this exercise of force. Right? And this is why, for Latour, no appeal to reason can displace the ultimately political process through which alliances form, stand up to one another, or give way to one another, change, and so on. It's encapsulated then in this idea, as I've said. What if there were no distinction between force and reason? That's really the kind of kernel of it. That's the real really gets to the point of what Latour is asking here, and what he's exploring as a possibility, what that would mean. How would we make sense of a political process in this situation? Ultimately, it means for Latour that decision-making is always a political work disguised as reason. We can't really make an appeal to reason without the political work having already gone on. And if anybody does make an appeal to reason, what he will go on to say here is that they're concealing from us the political work that was necessary to establish those equivalences which show themselves, if you like, as reason. Now, in his later work, this exposure of reason that sort of comes here from suspending its distinction from force. In his later work, this settles into more of an emphasis on negotiation and diplomacy. This is really what the political work is for Latour. Different networks may be brought into relation with one another to form a collective by establishing sufficient degrees of similarity in their basic internal organization. So that's the work of negotiation. One can negotiate with another, strike a compromise, form an alliance, right, and kind of amalgamate to some degree, form a sufficient commonality that a relation is formed there. So in this way, translation as a sort of negotiating process can reveal structures or modes of organization that recur across networks, because they make themselves similar. They find enough similarity to say, okay, yeah, we can live with this. Look, there's something we share here. And that becomes the basis for an alliance, a connection between the networks. Now, this idea seems to me to suggest a similarity with something in Michel Serres' work, and that's where I want to turn now. So Latour has said that though each actor in this story he's imagining of alliances and forces and so on, although each actor is local, it can move from place to place, at least as long as it is able to negotiate equivalences that make one place the same as another. That's what he says. That's a quotation. That we can move, we can make connections, we can travel from one place to another, we can extend our reach, if you like, establish those relations when we can negotiate equivalencies to make one place the same as another. Now, this idea that one place may be or may be made the same as another recalls Michel Serres' fascination with the figure of Harlequin from the Commedia dell'arte. And Harlequin appears often at different points in Michel Serres' work. And the story is that Harlequin has been on a trip to the moon and come back, and then everyone is anxious to find out what the trip was like, and asking him what was the moon like. And he replies that it is the same as here, more or less. Now, for Serres, this idea of degree is crucial, because to move from one place to another and back again, perhaps, involves a translation by virtue of which there is always, for Serres, a slight variation. That's always the key, variation. Nowhere is exactly the same as anywhere else. Nothing is perfectly equivalent to anything else. There is no perfect symmetry or equilibrium. Right? Now, this is not so different from Latour's principle that nothing is either reducible or irreducible to anything else, in the sense that equivalencies can be drawn or negotiated, but only imperfectly. Yet for Serre, it's important that there may still be, in spite of all these variations, there may still be invariances, formal patterns that recur through the variations. And his notion of invariance here is not the same as equivalence in Latour. For Serre, it's based on a mathematical formalism, and it's developed through his reading of Leibniz. And here, invariance signifies the recurrence of a purely formal or relational figure that nonetheless varies by virtue of the concrete setting in which it occurs. So for Serre, the world is endlessly variable, endlessly varying on itself. And to move from one place to another is neither to make each place equivalent to the last, nor to simply observe them in their difference. It is to link, through translation, one local place with another, and thereby to compose a world, a global world, that comprises variability. As Serre himself puts it, on his part, recalling the recalling the creation of the world by Leibniz's God, to which Latour referred as well. Serre describes this as by the displacement, he writes, by the displacement from site to site, I imitate the process of creation, or rather, knowledge is produced for me as being, or the real is for God. Right? So we can see here that Serre is making a very strong analogy, if you like, between the way in which God creates a world through this composition of compossibilities, and the way that knowledge is produced by us, the way that we can produce knowledge by linking the possibles, by finding out what is compatible and compossible. Right. Okay. So for Serre, to think is to move from one locality to another, where locality can take many forms. It could be a network of relations in a particular geographical place and time, or it could be scientific genre, a genre of writing, or even I think Serre often says relationship between the science and the humanities, and perhaps especially that's a really important example for him, the relationship between the sciences and the humanities. So the possibility of tracing variations from one locality to another is what allows Serre then, in his book The Natural Contract, which does talk about our relationship to nature and ecology and so on, although he doesn't use the word ecology, he's a little uncomfortable with the term, but it's on that problem. This idea of translation, of moving through variations, of finding those connections between variations, allows Serre there in that book, The Natural Contract, to propose that we may invent a form of reason that speaks truthfully and judges prudently. That is, a form of reason which connects the sciences and juridical practice or political judgment without simply reducing one to the other or imposing a single standard on them both. Now, that would be an extraordinary thing. We can talk about it perhaps in the questions, if to find this connection between a network, if you like, the language of the sciences and its knowledge, and the world of the sciences, and the world of politics. It's its form of truth, its form of judgment, its form of forging connections, the world that it makes. Right? Now, if, as I said, such a form of reason is possible, it won't be either one or the other, which is then extended to them both, right? It'll somehow exist as a sort of translation between variations, not even simply in the end, just the sciences and politics, but perhaps also, especially today, economics and the form of reason which we are attached to economics, for example, which is so dominant, that the form of reason that we may be looking for is something which can move between, which is composed by these variations between. Okay, for Latour, any such appeal to reason must remain dubious. Latour, I think, should be very skeptical about this idea that I've just outlined in Serre, on account of his views on irreducibility and translation. To put this another way, two different areas or regimes may be brought together, but this does not mean that it's the work of reason for Latour. This is still politics, or at least it should be politics, in the sense that calling it reason, as we saw, only serves to conceal this process by which that equivalence has been achieved. Negotiation must still begin with no shared assumptions, and it's the work of figuring out what can be shared that makes it political. As Latour writes, we too often tend to start with exchanges, equalities, and the transfer of equivalents, but we never talk about the preliminary work in which these equivalents are forged. It's as if we spoke of road networks, but never of civil engineering. Now, if you like, Latour is all about the civil engineering. If the pretense that reason, universal and neutral, transcends force, if that pretense conceals the actual practice of forming networks of equivalence, negotiation, diplomacy, what you really have is precisely all of that. The negotiation and diplomacy, it's still there. It's just concealed. Right? So Latour's emphasis on diplomacy and crossing between modes of existence, between networks and so on, all this sort of different languages he uses to talk about this. This emphasis on diplomacy and negotiation calls on us, Latour, to acknowledge that even the most robust scientific fact or the most compelling moral imperative is a stabilized outcome of a construction, bit of civil engineering, right, that needs to be recognized as political in its widest possible sense. The political challenge then becomes for him how to negotiate these constructions in such a way as to call into question, at least some of the time, force passing itself off as reason. Right? But Latour, a mode of existence is always negotiated, and as far as possible, that negotiation should be fixed and without preconditions. Now, in the absence of preconditions, there will always be alternative outcomes to any negotiated equivalence. Being able to reconfigure preconditions of any network means that no existing set of preconditions is necessarily binding, and therefore anyone can, in principle, leave any network at any time. But what does it mean to leave a network? How does one leave? Where does one end up? For Latour, the association of forces to form a network establishes an equivalence that remains local, and then different networks can bear on each other or not. Here's a longer quotation from him just to read through here. If we choose the principle of irreduction, we discover intertwined networks which sometimes join together but may interweave with each other without touching for centuries. There is enough room. There is enough space. Right. Lots of empty space. There is no longer an above and a below. Nothing can be placed in a hierarchy. The activity of those who rank is made transparent and occupies little space. There is no more filling in between networks, and the work of those who do this padding takes up little room. There is no more totality, so nothing is left over. It seems to me that life is better this way, he writes. Now, it's because networks may be intertwined without touching, as he puts it, that they can sometimes coexist for a long time without interfering with each other. But it also implies that we can step outside of any given one into an empty space where there is no hierarchy, no rank, and nothing of what Latour takes to be the difficult, frequently important, but often wearisome and hard work of building reasons, roads, if you like, and all the things that go on to make a world. The empty spaces between networks, as Latour identifies them here, ensure that there is no totality. If life seems better that way for Latour, it may be because the spaces ensure that no exclusion is final. It's always possible to begin again. No voice is definitively silenced. Negotiations always remain possible in the future. In other words, that empty space between networks is the condition for acting and speaking politically. And I think that's the key thing which I want to say here about Latour, that this idea of a discontinuity between networks, which comes directly from his beginning with the principle of irreducibility, is the condition for acting and speaking politically. Now, it's already been evident from Latour's perspective that Sayre's desire to invent a form of reason that could speak truthfully and judge prudently, a form of reason that establishes some kind of equivalence, shall we say, between the networks of knowledge and morality and politics, could harbour what we might call a political naivety. Sayre perhaps places too much trust in reason, signalling perhaps a readiness to avoid, to forego the hard work of negotiating without preconditions. So is Sayre simply avoiding the hard political work? On the other hand, Latour's emphasis on the spaces between networks, I think, invites a response from Sayre's point of view that diverges from Latour's presentation of politics. Right, not too far to go now, just a little bit. Now, I just need to outline briefly what I think this looks like in Sayre's work, and then just end with a couple of questions. Much of Sayre's work charts connections between networks of sense that initially appear quite separate from one another. That is to say, if you read his work, you will find him moving quickly between the sciences, arts, humanities, myth, religion, fables, stories, all kinds of different things, right? And it can be a little disorienting to begin with, but his thinking sort of moves between these and finds connections in and through the variations between them. He's never simply assumes that they're the same as each other, but he finds threads that you can follow to connect. And this, again, comes from his proximity to Leibniz and his understanding of invariance, which he finds there in Leibniz, but we'll leave that for now. But also comes, however, from his reading of Lucretius and Lucretian atomism, and the idea that in the beginning of the world, there was atoms rained down without any connection through the void, without any connection to one another. And then there was a spontaneous deviation, the clinamen, which led to collisions, and turbulence as they all crashed, and all these atoms crashed into each other. And then gradually, from that chaotic turbulence, vortices began to emerge, patterns, spiral patterns and patterns of circulation, eddies began to emerge, which are effectively the beginnings of order, right? As atoms began to combine with each other in certain ways and repeat certain patterns of movement and so on. So yeah, Sayre likes this idea in Lucretius, and follows it up in a way through his thinking through his thinking about Lucretius. And what he finds there is, in effect, between patterns of order, networks, should we say, it's not void, complete discontinuity, but just more disorder. It's matters of degree. There's maybe a little greater turbulence. So it's not that one moves from system to gap. There's just a confusion around the boundaries where the balance of order and disorder tips away from order towards a little bit of greater confusion and turbulence and so on, right? Boundaries for Sayre in this sense are rarely well defined. And that's partly because he follows his one-time mentor, Gaston Bachelard, by recognizing that in fact the way that we think is massively influenced by our assuming that the world is made up of solid objects, where in fact, for the most part, it's made up of things that are a bit sticky and smudgy and fluid, and or gases or pastes and things which flow and kind of deform and move about, right? So we don't really, in fact, have hard and fast boundaries between things. The world's made up of gases and fluids and pastes and things which are sort of which deform like this, you know. So and that means, as I said, boundaries are not well defined. You don't go from network to nothing. You go from something sort of gives way to something more confused around its fringes. Another thing that another way of thinking that Sayre was greatly influenced by was information theory. And he, in fact, we can say that every communication, every nice, strongly codified exchange of information between me and you, for example, now as I talk, is surrounded by noise of some kind, little distortions and bugs and things which kind of change it or get in the way. For Sayre, every movement meets resistance from what is around it. And while a movement through a network is more heavily codified than a movement between networks, it's only a matter of degree. Right? Now, the most recurrent example, one I've mentioned already for Sayre, of crossing is moving between things, is the link between the natural sciences and the humanities. And in one of his books, the fifth volume of the Hermes series, which hasn't yet been translated, but it might be on the way before very long, because the third volume is just about to appear quite soon. In the fifth volume of Hermes, that volume is called the Northwest Passage. He calls it the Northwest Passage, right? This shipping route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that runs through the frozen waters of the Arctic, packed with shifting ice flows. There's no clear or constant path that you can navigate. To find your way through, you have to negotiate with the moving ice. And for Sayre, the ice is not just an arbitrary obstacle, though it's certainly unpredictable. In effect, it contains its own prescriptions. Coming back to that word that I mentioned at the beginning. At times, the ice may block your way entirely. At other times, it opens up and offers you a route. Navigation requires negotiation. And Sayre's expression here, I think, resonates with Latour's politics. But for Sayre, one is always more or less bound by constraints of one kind or another. Writing of, or one might say with Lucretius, he describes the world as a vortex of vortices, interlacings, a maze of waves. There are no empty spaces here, Sayre. That's the thing. No fixed borders, only channels formed by flows of different kinds and flows that operate at different scales as well, right? And which kind of border on one another. As he writes, this is a short, the line his words. He says, "The stream is its own dike, the river its own wharves." So you don't have solid objects marking the fixed boundaries. Everything is moving. Right? However, even here, navigation is possible, right? And in the absence of a global map, each little step that you take, each incremental addition to the route has to be worked out as one goes along. And there is a form of reason for Sayre designed specifically for such a task, or at least kind of it fits, it kind of matches and works. And this is the technique of infinitesimal calculus devised by Leibniz, founded on the simple idea that there exists a path from the local to the global. This is Sayre's words. And this path extends from locality to locality, step by step by step. Now, in the classical period, it was expected that this idea of composition, of leading step by step by step from the local to the global, could lead to a view of the total system. The encyclopedia as a project, linking all branches of knowledge. But if that in that period, the route from locality to locality always seemed open, there was kind of optimism that we'd be able to follow that route to connect everything. We now think, and these are Sayre's words again, we now think that this extension is often impossible. In reality, our way making all these connections is often blocked, as in the Northwest Passage, and there may be nowhere to move to. But if moving from one locality to another through the integration of infinitesimal differences proves more challenging than promised, a little more discontinuous than the classical period and the Enlightenment thought would be the case, progress isn't halted altogether. We don't have to abandon all hope. Right? In Sayre's view, we should then learn lessons in composition from the world itself. Navigating the Northwest Passage provides a model for this. Unlike Descartes, who called on those who exercise their reason to move in a straight line, Sayre thinks this is a form of madness. Right? Instead, when we exercise our reason, we must read the shifting patterns of the ice, follow the channels as they open. Infinitesimal differences encode directions of possible continuation from one locality to the next. There are then forms of thinking more attuned to the fractured nature of the world for Sayre. But the navigation of the Northwest Passage is only one model couched at a specific scale of the ship on the sea, people on it, right? And in Sayre's thinking, the model is generalized to multiple scales, which is to say, navigating the frozen waters is just one variation among others. For Sayre, the history of the world around us extends right down to codes regulating the behavior of elementary particles, up through the formation of chemical compounds, through geological time, to the genes of living organisms, up through paleontology, I can't say it, paleontological history, thank you, and all the way up to cosmological time. Right. It's all a series of variations. Right. In each instance, order is coded, but always locally and in space and time. But we can find our way from one to another. Right? So to compose a world for Sayre is less to decipher a code once and for all than to trace its variations from site to site, from time to time. Written into things and their relations is what Sayre calls a pretext. And by following its line, rarely straight, we can participate in the composition of the world by following, extending, and modifying the sense of the world itself, its codes and patterns. And I think we can call this a form of reason, as long as we don't understand by this a universal order of some kind that we can apply to the world, or to which the world itself will eventually conform. In Sayre's terms, we follow a prescription that comes from the world itself. Crucially, for Sayre, this occurs at scales of space and time way beyond those of human life and history, but that run through human life and history, right? That comprise human life and history. So thinking in this way reframes our sense of politics as one variation among others in a vast and complex universe, if you like. I was going to read this little text here. I've gone on for quite long enough, perhaps already. So no, let me read it because I've only got a short, a little bit to go, and I think it's a lovely passage. Actually, it might just give you a little sense. It doesn't speak directly to what I'm saying here, but I think it kind of illustrates it in a nice way. It comes from towards the end of the book, The Birth of Physics, and it's about the way in which we can read the world in things and learn from them. He says, take a thing in your hands, anything at all, from the earth, from the water, a stone, or an animal. Read this object of the world. Read it as it was written, in the letters of its atoms, written in its crystalline depths and in its full, smooth molecules which roll against each other, is how this thing was born, is how it was made part of nature. It is the written memory of its formation, of its emergence from chaos. It's a lovely, lovely passage, I think. Right, to sum up then, while Latour sees in the separation between networks an opportunity for negotiation, politics, in Sayre's view, at the borders of a network, there are only sort of a series of deformations and convolutions through which one enters a more or less stable form of order. Right? And there's no kind of outside as such from which one can survey or engineer the passage. One must navigate from within, from locality to locality at incremental scales, if necessary. And it's this that constitutes the work of what I think you can call reason. Conceived in this way, reason does not conceal the act of making. Sorry, interrupting my train of thought there. It doesn't, reason does not conceal the act of making one thing equivalent to another, one network equivalent to another, as Latour suggests it does, because reason depends precisely on there being differences, variations, right? And what for Latour is the work of political negotiation displaces reason and shows it to be trickery or worse. All of that for Sayre is a plural and changeable logic, could one say, running through multiple processes at multiple scales of space and time. So, although for Sayre there is no process is fixed forever, it's also true that every process has a history that places constraints on what can follow next. We can be guided by this prescription written into things without thereby giving ourselves over to some false naturalism. That is to say, without thinking that nature is some external authority that we simply have to obey. Latour and Sayre then each propose models of decision-making that extend beyond politics in its conventional sense, shall we say. Both reject the idea that reason provides a transcendent foundation for judgment, and both show that the work of composition occurs locally through movement from one association to another. Yet there's a contrast, I think, between how they understand what guides this movement. For Latour, the absence of preconditions makes negotiation indispensable. Decisions emerge from fragile, revisable alliances, and politics is about keeping these negotiations open. For Sayre, the task is to navigate constraints inscribed in the world itself. Reason lies in the coded forms of the material world. The difference, to put it as starkly as I can, is this. Latour turns to the empty spaces between networks and finds there a site of diplomacy and politics. Sayre turns to the prescriptions coded into the world, not just into human history, but beyond human history. From Latour's perspective, I think Sayre risks underestimating the political work needed to keep collectives open. From Sayre's point of view, I think Latour risks drawing the focus of political decision-making too closely around the human scale, neglecting the ways in which decision-making is foreshadowed, prefigured in material processes themselves, right? So these two positions, expose, I think, we might say a twofold demand of decision making today. One is to acknowledge the openness of negotiation, while also recognizing the constraints and prescriptions that shape not only what's possible, but what in Sayre's view is prudent, right? A good choice. The divergence between them clarifies the stakes of political thought when collectives are understood as more than human, right? And when composing a world requires both diplomacy and attention to the codes of the world itself. Perhaps now, at a time of ecological emergency, the difference between them takes on particular weight. Latour reminds us that politics cannot be short-circuited, even under duress, while Sayre insists that negotiation must work within the constraints that shape our world's form. And perhaps taken together, they suggest that ecological decision-making must be both sort of inclusive in Latour's sense and also attentive to the prescriptions of the earth and of the material world. Okay, there we are. Thank you for that. I shall stop there, and apologies that I went on slightly longer than I intended, but we've rounded off there, and I've left. There's a few questions that we might discuss, although I'll be very happy to ignore those and to respond to anything that you'd like to ask yourselves.
Well, thank you so much for this inspiring and rich talk. So I think we have a lot to take with us and reflect and ask you questions also in the future, because it's my all in between and these variations are flying around. But thank you also for sharing these passages, for example, with the beauty of the language, and where you know how difficult it is as a translator, bring in such a great writer as Ser, and it resonates also how you read that. I'm not asking that many questions because we already have one here, and our students would like to ask you questions, or our guests actually in general. So now everybody can use the Q&A button there, where you can post your question, and then I will read that. And David, you can also open that so that you can read that too, if you prefer. That's but in any case, I will read it loudly for everybody. And we have many questions, so we will try to give you our best to address most of them. So one question. So thanks you first for the great lecture. And then the question comes here. Would you say that empty spaces are the noises of prehistory?
Which is a great line.
Yeah, this is already a poetic question here. I read the whole question, but then
yes.
choose how to. Beautiful. I would write that down. What I mean are the sounds of disorder before the articulated ordered sound. Also, do you think that prehistoric sounds are always there, hovering in the background of order, meaning that empty spaces are never really empty?
That's such, Colette, that's such a lovely thought, and so beautifully expressed, I have to say. There's such a lot in there. Yeah, I really do like that formulation. So let's just take a little look at it and see what's trying to see what's going on there. I think that actually in that first sentence, would you say that then the empty spaces are the noises of prehistory? That's almost an encapsulation of the difference between Latour and Serre, at least as I understand it and as I've tried to present it. For Latour, empty spaces. For Serre, noise, something which is just there beyond our neighborhood, beyond our little settled locality, our settled world, where we are and where we're at home, where things make sense to us. And so for Serre, then not empty spaces, but noises of prehistory. Right? Why prehistory? Well, I think perhaps one might say, well, maybe not necessarily prehistory, might be other kinds of contemporaneous history, but I do think that prehistory is quite suggestive, because then I think that what's suggestive about it, someone's asked if that can be posted so that they can read it. Is that possible? People are not. I don't know. I'll leave that with you.
Yeah. Thanks.
The idea that for Serre, it can be a prehistory because it is what has not yet, what precedes the thread, the sequence, the series of connections that we currently recognize it as being history, our history, what we recognize as history. The key thing perhaps would be that one of the things that Sayre does, and he's not alone in this, but he has made it a significant feature of his thinking, is that he develops what he calls a great story, where he thinks it's enormously significant that we can now date accurately, not just events going back to the Bronze Age or the whatever in sort of early human history, but we can go right back into sort of early dinosaurs or early paleontological periods, or we can date the origins of the Earth. We can date bits of rock that landed from space. We can date the origin of the universe, and this means that everything is connected into, sort of demonstrates, if you like, this kind of connection between all of these stories. So in a sense, my only kind of tiny quibble with the way that you put it there, which I otherwise think is absolutely beautiful, is that for Sayre, at least, there wouldn't be anything we could identify as prehistory, because there's only history. There's history everywhere. But everything else you say there, I think, is very well put. The sounds of disorder before the articulated ordered sounds. Yes, yeah, and they are sort of surrounding us, and this is the sort of noise in which our own communication with each other and with ourselves, our sense making is kind of bathed and surrounded in this noise, and we can take from it, and it's from there that something new emerges. Yeah, something new comes up, that we make new sense. Yeah, we extend our sense making in new ways. Well, thank you for that. That's really lovely. Right, Julia. So if humans go with the flow, says prescriptions, the Northwest Passage, aren't we at the mercy of the flow? Yes, good question. What if the flow is not compatible with the value or desire of a collective that is more than human? Do we need to change our values to move and make connections between locations? And if we do not, is this where the force of reason happens in making a straight line through the ice? Yes, instead of following the available path. Great question, Julia. Thank you. I'm conscious that my presentation both tries to tease out some complications while inevitably also simplifying a lot and missing kind of complications, and you've put your finger on one of them here. So yeah, if we go with the flow, then aren't we at the mercy of the orders of things, the Northwest Passage? Now, if that is then asked, if that flow is not compatible with the desire of a collective that is more than human, right, what happens? Well, I think for Sayre, I'll answer in that way, because I'm not sure what I would want to say ultimately about this in my own voice, so to speak. But I think for Sayre, violence happens. Right? Violence. And he's many of his works, especially his later writings, are filled with examples and stories of human actions, human values, human feelings and attachments, which are in effect incompatible with the world around them. Right. And that incompatibility manifests itself as violence towards the non-human world. that's the sort of area that we're thinking about. That's the problem that we're thinking about at the moment, of course. But violence doesn't respect any particular categorizations and boundaries. For him, violence would be this insistence on going in a straight line, regardless, right? And so if we find ourselves constrained in certain ways and we just decide to bash our way through, that is that's violence. And if there's one, people often feel that in reading Michel Serres' work, there's a sort of an ethical quality or dimension to his work, even though he doesn't write about ethics or provide us with a systematic ethics or something like that. But the one theme which runs through almost everything he writes, perhaps everything he writes, is what it takes to reduce violence. He doesn't think that it can be eliminated. There is always some degree of violence. I mean, his book, The Parasite, will sort of express that, where parasitism is the first relation. Something takes without giving back. But his thinking is really dedicated to how we can minimize violence and what that could mean. So I think that's what that sort of responds, I think, to that first part of your question there. Do we need to change our values to move and make connections between locations? So I would say yes, we do. And if we do not, is this where the force of reason happens, making a straight line through the ice? Exactly, yes, instead of following the available path. Yeah, that's right. That's right, exactly. And there's a passage in his, just near the beginning of his book on Leibniz, where he contrasts, I mean, this sort of speaks to what you're saying here. He contrasts Descartes' idea that in order to get through a forest, the best thing to do is to go in a straight line. And he says, this is obviously Descartes has never tried to walk through a forest, because if you try to just always walk in a straight line, very soon you'll be completely lost, because you're constantly deviated from your path, because you can't go in a perfectly straight line. It's just an abstract ideal, which is absolutely kind of just stupid. First of all, it doesn't work. And secondly, if you get to the, even if you could keep going in a straight line, you would learn nothing about the space you'd been walking through. Right? You'd learn nothing about it. The way to find your way through a forest is by following routes, following little pathways and the clearings and sort of streams or whatever. And then you begin to compose a map of the place. You begin to understand this place, and you can find your way through it. That's a better way to think about moving through a forest, or indeed the Northwest Passage, although that's more complicated because it keeps changing. Please do come back with a response if you want to add, Colette or Julia, to anything I've said, or ask anything further.
Well, thank you for this, because this went also in the direction of the free spirit of Nietzsche, right? So that what happens if one goes in another direction, or so. I think while we're getting other questions here, maybe I can ask you, and see how you can bring that back. Well, I have so many here, but one, since also Simonetta talked about your participation in Vatimo's dictionary, I really had to think about violence there too. So now that you were talking about violence, what would it mean? And that it's impossible also in the Parasite, for example, eliminating that is impossible. So Vatim also says that it's pretty impossible to eliminate violence, but he's searching for a kind of diminishing violence.
Yes.
So having less, so impoverishment of violence. Would that also go here in this direction, so that violence maybe in a kind of small amount would be a kind of part of this network of networks, or what? Yeah, how do you see that here? Maybe.
So you mean that in talking about this kind of composition of a world, actually what is at stake is diminishing violence, and that's part of the.
If it makes sense, so that maybe even eliminating violence could be also strange, so paradoxically, but then diminishing a lot, so that is a kind of one of the forces. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that's it's a great connection to make up with Vatima. We know the kind of his opposition to strong metaphysics and what that means in terms of a kind of an imposition on the way that people think and ultimately live. Definitely. And in many ways, I think you can read Vatima's work as an exploration of what it means to kind of understand as one goes along, to make those connections as we go. So in a way, there is something really quite resonant, I think, between the between that way of thinking from Vatima and its hermeneutics and what we find in Serre, although the kind of context and the way it's expressed and thought out, its terms are quite different, but there's something very similar between them. It's a great example of the sort of invariance between different examples, because they're completely different, and yet there's something which is actually very consistent between them in a certain way. I guess what I'm sort of suggesting really in this talk through Serre is that that we don't have to give up on the idea of reason, as Serre himself suggests, but we can understand reason as this forming of relations in a way which is consistent with avoiding violence. Right. So that question of avoiding violence is actually really important to what reason might be, and I think that provides. I think that provides an interesting, perhaps welcome sort of counterpoint to a lot of writing which sees reason itself as inherently violent, right? Because of its imposition of universal concepts and categorizations and so on, right? It's inevitably reductive. It's always going to be violent in its practice somehow, and I think what we learn from Serre, and I don't want to be negative about Latour. I'm a huge admirer of his work, and I think it does some really, really important things. But I'm finding this perhaps especially in Serre. But I think you're right. You can point to this in a thinker like Vatima as well. Is that it offers the kind of possibility for a kind of rehabilitation of reason in a certain way, because it offers a suggestion of a way in which a practice of reason could be non-violent, or at least committed to the minimization of violence.
Well, please, Simonetta.
Thank you, David. I don't want to interrupt, but I don't see any more questions, so maybe we can end it here since we are at the hour and a half. But I wanted to maybe take off from here to just, I don't know if it's really a question, but I'm really fascinated by this idea of what you said during your presentation, to think is to move from one locality to another, you know, in many different meanings of that moving, right? Localities can be geographical, but it can also be disciplinary.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I wonder, and again, I'm going to think mostly of Serre, just because I'm a little bit more familiar with him than with Latour. But I wonder, you know, the fact that he writes in such a beautiful poetic form makes me think that perhaps, you know, there's a link here also to include art in this discussion. Although I don't know that Serre, maybe you can help me here, I don't know that he really explicitly refers to it. You know, he's mostly interested in science and literature to some extent. But
well, he does.
What does it mean, the fact that he writes in such a way? And that's another link with Lucretius, right? Who was a poet, philosopher. So what do you have to say about his mode of writing?
Okay, great question. First of all, I would say that, and again, he's not alone in this, but he has his own particular way of doing it, that if we want to talk about a kind of reason that we can find here in the way that Serre thinks, following those suggestions, it's not going to look like logic and rules of inference, and it's not going to be something which you just have to write in a very dry and analytic fashion. It is about ways of making connections. It is a way about ways of moving through variations, right? And what kinds of variations? Well, I think just a perfect illustration, I think, is what Sylvia offered a few minutes ago, thinking about the connections between Serre and Latour. Right? Completely different thinkers, you would say, but there is something invariant between them, which is a concern with violence and its reduction, and about how violence happens, right? And that allows you then to make a really interesting connection between them, and to start sort of exploring links and to bring them together in a way which normally you don't think of them being together, right? That's a great example, I think, of what that sort of thinking through variations, locality to locality, can be. So that, in that case, two thinkers, but as you said, it could be different disciplines, or it could be different problems, or it could, and so on and so on. Now, Serre certainly then wants to think in this way, and because this is not just about then developing a new logic or something which can then just be endlessly repeated and applied anywhere, it's always got to be figured out sort of as you go along. And what you're figuring out are some sort of formal characteristics and similarities which appear to be repeated, like that I did when I said formal similarity, the reduction of violence, say, in that example, you know. And he does certainly write about, yes, fables and myths and sciences and humanities and literature, also art. I mean, the perhaps the most the best known example of this is his essay on thermodynamics and Turner, the painter Turner, right? Saying that in Turner's work you find a perfect elaboration of the principles of thermodynamics, and it's no coincidence that he was writing about this transition from an age of wind and sail, in the end of the sailing boats, and the beginning of the steam and furnaces and coal and burning and clouds and so on, and painting this just at the time that that Carnot and Boltzmann and so on were elaborating the principles of thermodynamics, right, which is all about heat and the transfer of heat and energy and so on. So this is he was elaborating these ideas before even the scientists had figured them out exactly, right? And that's a perfect example again of this kind of connections that he would make between different disciplines, including art. So art can certainly do this. Art can certainly do this. It's not just then about a sort of it clearly art goes beyond simply sort of representational sort of exercise and so on. I think it for Sarah, and I think we can see this, I think we can accept this easily enough without just having to attribute it to Sarah. It's simply a way of thinking. Yeah, I could say that art is a way of thinking, no less than any other way of thinking. And then when we want to think about the relationships between the sciences and the humanities, as Sarah does, fine, okay, that doesn't mean generally let us think about the sciences and the humanities. It's more for Sarah about drawing connections between particular examples. It's always about specificity. It's always about the particular example, locality to locality, not general discipline to general discipline, right? And so yes, Turner was thinking through the questions to do with how the world changes when it leaves behind wind and canvas as a means of energy and movement, and turns to coal and heat. And Turner was doing that, and just at the same time as scientists were thinking about the principles of thermodynamics. So you have there, this is thinking. These are two instances of thinking. And for Sarah, certainly, and I'm quite certain that everybody here would agree, there is absolutely no reason to privilege one necessarily over the other. Right? These are different forms of thinking.
Thank you, David.
Well, thank you so much. I think there is nothing to add besides us saying with this reflection on thinking and the arts. It's also thanking you and everybody that came and participated for the great questions, and enjoy the after thinking and with thinking that will resonate after this great lecture. So thank you so much and see you soon.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you all.